Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to today's program Chris Cameron, who is Senior Solution Architect at Elemica. And today we're going to talk about driving innovation with supply chain operating networks. Now, what is a supply chain operating network? Well, that's part of what we're going to talk about and discuss today. But I've certainly been a big proponent of the model. Been something that I've been talking about and writing about for more than a decade. And it's certainly something that over the years has gained a lot more momentum, a lot more understanding, and certainly that's been the case over the past couple of years here. So certainly looking forward to having this conversation with Chris and kind of getting his insights and perspective on kind of the where we are today with supply chain operating networks, where they're heading, and how customers are using it today. Before we get into the conversation, just want to remind you that part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is, to make this an interactive conversation. So as Chris and I are having our conversation, if you've got a question or a comment for Chris, you can go ahead and post it via the question button. I'll keep an eye on that, and certainly if we've got time and it's a good and appropriate question, I'll go ahead and weave it into the conversation. I do want to remind you that if you are joining us as a visitor, you do have to sign in first before you can ask a question. So with that, Chris, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Adrian.
So Chris, before we kind of dive in and talk about supply chain operating networks, I always like to ask my guests, to find out how they got involved with supply chain logistics to begin with. So why don't you, briefly tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why did you get involved with supply chain logistics, and what's your current role and responsibilities there at Elemica?
Sure. So I got actually started in supply chain logistics back in around 1992. I actually went overseas to teach English in Thailand and collected samples of products and things that I was going to come back and get in the business of importing. I got back to the States and realized I had no idea how to get those back to the States and get paid for the goods and all of that fun stuff. So I graduated college and took off as a career, actually chose a career as a freight forwarder, became an international freight forwarder, did third-party logistics. And then along the way, I got posted to an assignment for Caterpillar Logistics where we were doing the analytics, and I started to understand why freight moves, not just how to move it. And so that kind of took my career from being a guy who would travel agent for boxes and moved me towards the supply chain of how to create these, how to be demand-driven, all the various constraints that you run into in Brazil and India and some things like that. And so that has led me in a path here to the chemical industry and then to Elemica, where now applying some of those same logistics skills to the overall supply chain and looking at it end to end from the customer side all the way through to the supply side with your two sub logistics cycles on the inbound and the outbound delivery.
Great, great background there, and it's always interesting to hear from folks how they get into the industry. So going from going overseas and freight forwarding, Caterpillar, and now at Elemica. So a great kind of diversity of experience there. So let's talk now about talk about the process industries. I always kind of joke that if you work in the process industries, you don't feel a lot of love from supply chain analysts and publications because there's so much focus today on what's happening in retail with omni-channel fulfillment, right? What's happening in high tech, consumer goods. So that's where a lot of the attention is, a lot of the buzz is, but obviously there's a lot of interesting things happening, supply chain trends and challenges and opportunities, also happening in the process industries. It just doesn't get as much attention. So, what are some of those things that are happening in the process industries? What are you hearing from clients?
Well, what I kind of see happening is something I saw happen in the late 90s in the high tech world when actually at that time I was working on some supply chain items for Apple and Dell, especially as iPods and iPhones are rolling out. And I'm watching some of the same things happen in the process industry finally. So you always see that process industry is really, it's all about the plant and make sure that you can keep the plant running and make sure you've got the lowest or the highest utilization for the lowest per unit cost coming out the door. And so that's similar to what I saw back when we were flying stuff all over the place to feed a Dell facility, or when Apple, all they cared about was making sure that the store took the order for the iPod. And then they started realizing that, hey, it's about the supply chain. I've got to connect the demand all the way through to the supply side. And I'm starting to see that same trend happen within our client base in the process industry, where I go to meetings now, and they start to talk about brand new concepts that they're going to start bringing out or making changes in their SAP system to do. And come to find out, it's the same thing we did in automotive in the late 90s or the early 2000s, and in the high tech even before then. So we're seeing kind of that move away from to address the customer side rather than just keep the plant moving so that you can produce 80 tons of goop at a time, and then we'll just kind of figure it out in some kind of static supply chain. And that's similar to what we saw happening when Dell kind of took control of the reins down in Austin and said, I won't take 5,000 kilos of disk drives anymore. I want to order 5 of them at a time, and you deliver them every 10 minutes. So that kind of same process, and I think you'll start to see the folks in the supply chain maybe get a little more love as that matures the way it did in the high tech and the automotive industry.
Yeah, so it sounds like really, to paraphrase a little bit what you said, is kind of moving away from this kind of very manufacturing-centric, view of the world where, asset utilization and, capacity of manufacturing was kind of the primary focus, to now really truly taking a more supply chain view and really linking supply with demand, and paying closer attention to demand, and being able to be more, all the other buzzwords you hear, right? Be more demand driven, being more responsive, being more flexible. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And when you look in the chemical industry, you get some of like your emulsions and some of your commodities. Your margin may be 1.5, 3%, and while your engineered polymers, those are that get consumed at 3 or 4 tons at a time, going directly into an automotive or to an electronics manufacturer. Your margins start to be 15%, and we're starting to see some segmentation of that happen within the industry to do just that. And you're compartmentalizing your commoditized products while focusing more on your value add products.
So now let's talk about, well, how do they actually get from kind of where they used to be and kind of move up the maturity curve, if you will? I mean, what are some of the biggest obstacles that the companies in the process industries need to overcome, again, to move up that maturity scale, up that sophistication curve? Are there lessons that they can learn from other industries, such as high tech, as you've mentioned, that they can apply?
So there's a couple of things we see going on in our little niche here right now. Is one along the lines of these segmentations. So, and some of the obstacles have been the operating system. Many of our clients that we see in the process industries were some of the first adopters of SAP, and we see SAP really has the market share in our space because it was a manufacturing type of ERP package. And so what we're seeing is a lot of those guys do a couple of things. They're spinning off many of their commodity divisions, and you're kind of seeing that happen every time the quarterly reports go out. Number two, as they do that segmentation, they're kind of keeping certain industries, and they're changing their SAP. We've got a number of different clients today that are moving from instances of R2 to an ECC type of SAP platform, where they're actually starting to track and trace down to the carton level. That was not a way of thing of the past. So they've understood, and we've seen some of our clients, especially those along the way who still have the R2 platform, they would come up to us and say, well, I've got these packed goods, they call them, versus the bulk goods. We would ask questions like, okay, where can we find the piece count in order to tell your trucker how much to come pick up? And the answer would be that we keep that over here in a text field. Well, it's kind of hard to automate when something's in a text field. And we're seeing a number of our clients understand that and make those changes, either whether it's a full version upgrade or whether they just do an enhancement for that particular one. And the other thing that I'm watching happen, when I first came into the chemical industry it's only about 3 or 4 years ago, Supply chain was driven by the procurement guys. I actually had one guy in a previous life who told me all innovation comes from procurement, which I had been in the aerospace and automotive and high tech side, and I went, can you say that again? Because I missed something there in the translation. But we're starting to see more and more of our clients, especially those of the leading names, where procurement's still a part, and it's always going to be a part because you have to feed a plant. So you've got to get as much utilization as possible. But now they're bringing in the business in within it, and they're bringing in some thought leaders from the outside world to be able to say, here's a way you can morph this so that you need to care about how your supplier is delivering to you, not just demand it. And then you need to flow that through, because in the middle you've got your available to promise date. And that S&OP process has always been a real pain for our client base, and they're starting to do that. So we see it at the management level, at the C level, that's starting to change, and you're getting different decision makers who are involved in it, as opposed to just the plant saying, this is how we're going to run.
Yeah, very interesting examples there. I mean, obviously, a lot of change management, required. A lot of different approaches required in terms of how they're utilizing technology and upgrading, their technology to kind of align with kind of a newer way of doing things. And like you said, bringing in the different talent, that come at it from a different perspectives to help them kind of move along that curve. So a lot of interesting pieces of that puzzle. Of course, from my perspective, supply chain operating networks are a piece of that puzzle, and it's no secret, like I said in the beginning, that I'm a huge proponent of the model, which to me, the way I define it, and at a very high level, it kind of brings together B2B connectivity with supply chain applications along with social networking, to help, trading partners to kind of take that more supply chain view, if you will, and have all the trading partners be able to communicate and collaborate, more effectively. And certainly a lot going on. There's been a lot of evolution, to that over the years. Can you give us an example of how kind of the supply chain operating network model is helping companies transform their supply chain, and how does it differ from kind of the quote unquote traditional old ways of doing things?
Mm-hmm. So what we've kind of seen, there's actually a slide I use in many of my conversations with our clients, and we use the Gartner supply chain maturity model, and basically stage 3, 4, and 5, because everybody wants to get to stage 5 to get to the demand and sensing type of model. But when Elemica was first formed by our client base, we were just supposed to automate in that stage 3. So we just basically helped to automate and get that automation out the door. And so that's what everybody seemed to be doing in the turn of the century. It makes us sound old, but in the early 2000s there. And then what they did in that stage 4, and this is where we see a number of them have been stuck for about a decade, and now they're starting to move out of it. But they outsourced to a dominant partner. So they have a particular, let's call it a toller or a contract manufacturer. They have a particular logistics service provider, and they started to silo those providers until they became dominant. And what we're seeing a trend now happen among our client base is they suddenly said, I have to get to that Amazon experience because my customers are asking, where's my shipment? I have to ship in smaller amounts, but yet I'm sole sourced. I only have my dominant partner who's taking care of, is basically feeding my information. So what I know is what they know. So we're seeing many of our clients start to move towards an Uber visibility layer that they control. Back when I was a 3PL, we used to give away the software to our clients because at that point the cost of change was very high. We always got the freight, and there was an advantage that I would get the freight at the same time you would get the data back. But you can't really do that because freight providers and logistics service providers are different. You're never going to have one global customs broker. The guys in Brazil are different than the guys in the U.S. versus Europe. So you've got to take ownership of that data. And we have a pipeline that started to develop where they're less interested about executing in an automated fashion the way they were at the beginning of Elemica's life, and more asking, hang on a second, I need to see that visibility and take a look at everything over the top of the picture. So we started to see that trend in terms of the execution side. And then because of S&OP changes that have run within the supply chain or within the chemical and process industry community, we're starting to watch more of our clients ask about doing VMIs, vendor managed inventories, do delivery schedules, because at that point, and this is very similar to what I saw happen in the late 90s in the high tech sector, that's exactly the process those guys followed, where they step in and they say, all right, if I can get a hold of that schedule, if I can look at the inventory and have some plugins to be able to see what's there, then actually I'm going to be able to feed that backwards to my plant, and I can get my utilization while driving smaller quantities and needed value add quantities to my client, because then I can build in a, a part of my delivery architecture using vendor managed inventory, using service providers, because now I'll own the visibility layer, not just be dependent on a service provider, and I'll be able to see what's driving my discrete orders. And that becomes key. When you're able to do that, that's how, I watched Lockheed do that with the U.S. Air Force on a couple of their airframes. Same thing. Dell kind of did it a little bit away by producing their point of sale data on a more frequent basis. And Apple, of course, drove it quite a bit differently. But we're starting to see those same things trickle down into the process industries and really make a change, so that the leaders of the industry are stepping up to say, all right, we've got to fundamentally change how we operate and produce material from one end of our value chain to another.
Yeah, interesting. It sounds like part of it is kind of this emphasis. The emphasis is changing from kind of automating kind of the way we've always done things to now really putting in the foundation for end-to-end visibility to be able to drive some efficiencies and transformation of business processes by having more timely, accurate, complete visibility across all facets of the supply chain, both upstream with suppliers, downstreams with customers and orders, and then that feeding S&OP and VMI and some of these other processes you talked about. So when so kind of to build upon that, looking at kind of the unique requirements that the process industries have, beyond visibility, obviously visibility sounds like it's one of those key capabilities that a supply chain operating network must provide. What other capabilities must a supply chain operating network provide to meet the needs of the process industries?
Sure, sure. So there's kind of three things that I talk about every time I go out with a customer, and whether that's in the logistics cycle, the demand cycle, or the supply cycle. It'll be validation, it'll be triangulation, and it'll be adjudication. And so what we mean by that is the validation part is, and this is kind of, you can kind of see this move up the level of maturity from the automation where it started. But we were always validating, I have a map, I'm going to send this back and forth between trading partners. But now what we're starting to see is people say, I need to know inside of that map what's going on. Did I get my customer need date? Do I have my part number? And even looking within that to validate it, because we obviously have customers ordering from our clients and they order by the customer part number. Our client can't create an order in their enterprise system without that. So doing that validation within the network, as opposed to just being a simple trading partner where I've got my map, you've got your map, I'll trade this back and forth like love letters through the mail or something like that. So we see that validation really starting to play a part, and people asking us to do more about that. The second one is the triangulation. It's kind of like having how we have with our kids where one tells on the other. You kind of need that in a supply chain operating network. So you have, if it were a shipment, you're looking at it to say, well, somebody says that here's my ETA, it's going to sail this time, it's going to move in this direction. Do you have more than one pipeline for the source data, or are you just tied to your dominant partner? Can you also triangulate around the same shipment reference number for a given delivery? So then that way we can say, here's what the underlying carrier says, here's what my dominant partner says, and you're able to put those together, and in that way you're improving the data quality in the life cycle of a delivery to your customer. And then the last one we see is the adjudication. It's where the supply chain operating network has to become the judge, jury, and executioner of the data traveling within it. I was on a call, ironically, earlier this morning where somebody asked, hey, you've connected us to a partner and they keep ordering in less than our minimum order quantities. Elemica, can you just stop that for me? So we actually had a conversation about, okay, I'll take your map and I'll run it through an app and I'll hold your master data in there. Now, it's not the SAP master data, which is about, it's a canonical about 9 miles long, but I saw a subset of their master data and look at it and say, all right, now what do you want me to do with this order? Do you want me to reject it, accept it, or do you want me to go ahead and bump it up to the next level and send it on through to you? Once you get to where, because that's always been the enemy of automation in B2B, missing little data elements that make the whole thing, the whole house of cards kind of come down. But when it's a true supply chain operating network as opposed to just connected partners, then you've taken and externalized some of your business rules and put them outside the house so that they can clean the messages coming back into the house. Now all of a sudden, SAP does a lot of the things you always thought it was going to do. And the same thing goes for Oracle or JDE or any number of ERP packages. But now you've fed it the right data, the right information, and so you start to get more out of your ERP package.
Yeah, great example there. Let me. We've got a question here from Shauna. I'm going to go ahead and put it on the air. Let's see if we can. When meeting with customers to discuss connecting to a supply chain operating network, who is at the table? What roles are typically involved?
I wish there were a typical. We see everything from, we'll have a CSR there all the way up to a C-level in the organization. Most of the time, if you look down to your Fortune 500 scale, if someone's in the top tier of the Fortune 500, we'll see a director, we'll see a supply chain VP or director of that one. And then as we move down, we'll get into lower tiers within the organization. But the better way to answer that question, and here's who I don't see at the table quite often, where's the business leader? Where is the director of that particular business unit? So the more innovative solutions that we've started to see over the last 3 to 4 years are because the business driver, the director of the X division showed up and said, here's the problem, and was there at the beginning at the table, as opposed to our IT guys showing up and they ask a specific question, you get a specific answer. That's not the best way to construct the solution in this area. One, we need to start from the business to understand what they have. The IT guy has to be there so we understand the constraints that we have to live within. And then you put that together, and now you're going to get that solution. So that's best answered is that's the person or the man or the woman that I see at the table not often enough.
Great. That's a great point. Shauna, thank you for the great question. And I think that leads us nicely to kind of my next question, because ideally, which is really about how do you measure the benefits of a supply chain operating network, right? And what are the key metrics? And ideally, and this is true for any, solution, ideally you want to, tie the value to some higher level business objectives and desired outcomes, beyond kind of the more tactical and operational and perhaps even IT goals that you might have, and having, to your point, having that business leader in the conversation early up front, setting, driving kind of what those desired outcomes and what those business objectives are, I would assume, is part of how you would like to construct the business case and the way to measure the value of a supply chain operating network. So your thoughts on that, and how do you go about measuring the value?
So for us in measuring the value, and what we're really looking as the key metrics is, and there's a number of them that you'll find out there. What's my on-time ship? What's my perfect shipment? My on-time delivery? And any number of ways to look at that. But the key one that we see, if they all have this one common element to them that I've seen so far, and that is data quality. Everybody there's a lot of analytics software out there, and that stuff is really, really good, and nobody believes it. You'll produce your report for your senior manager, and he goes, I don't believe that, because he knows that something happened yesterday down as shipping clerk, et cetera. We forgot an order here, there, He's like, is that accounted for? And no one can tell. And so what we're starting to see, that's the reason from an Elemica standpoint, we're really, everything we do is wrapped around that supply chain operating network, and the app is secondary. The app is 40% or less of the equation. You're going to run 60% on the network itself to be able to say, all right, I need to be able to find those 3 points I mentioned earlier of validating, triangulating, adjudicating in order to get the type of data, clean data, because, and no one's ever going to get to 100%. That's chasing the speed of light. You can't get there. Even when you get point of sale data from like an Apple store, those guys control their whole supply chain and still don't have 100% data accuracy. But you've got to get into the 90s and the 95s plus, because then at that point, your analytics tools start to be able to tell you something valuable that you can make a change within your business operations that has meaning. But so as we're going out and doing, that's one of the reasons we see this drive towards the global visibility, is because no one believes the underlying data of their supplier on-time performance, their inbound carriage performances, and outbound deliveries to customers. And the customers are the ones who look at you and go, no, it was late. You have to be able to defend that. I mean, when I sat on our customer side, there were so many times we delivered it to the terminal, only to find out that our customer had put in a rule that said, don't deliver to me unless I got a full trailer. So it sat there for 3 days, yet we were getting blamed for not having it delivered on time. Is your visibility network set up in such a way so that you can see it was at the delivery terminal 3 days early, and we know your business rule for this plant in Ada, Oklahoma says, deliver me a trapped trailer which is when everything's full. So those are the kinds of things you have to know. Otherwise, you're making decisions on bad data, which leads to bad decisions.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, you just underscored kind of a soapbox topic for me that I've been kind of talking about, for 15 years, and that's, poor data quality. That I refer to it as the Achilles heel of supply chain management, because it doesn't matter, how fancy or great, a supply chain your supply chain portfolio of solutions, software solutions are. If the data you're feeding it is not timely, it's not accurate, it's not complete, it's the old saying, garbage in, garbage out, and certainly I see that as one of the key value propositions of a supply chain operating network as well, and why I personally believe that companies ought to get out of the connectivity business themselves, because they're obviously not doing a good job themselves, and I think that's part of the value that a network provider can bring, because theoretically, that should be a core focus of the business, is making sure that the data is timely, accurate, and complete to help drive, a lot of the process transformations, a lot of the visibility you're talking about, and so forth. We've got another question here. I'm going to go ahead and put it up on the screen. It's from Becky, and what size organization typically uses a supply chain operating network, and are they suitable for small to medium-sized businesses or large enterprises only?
There's not really a difference in the size of the person using it, because we all have a supply chain operating network. But how you implement it is different whether you're a small or a large company in that area. As a large company, you have multiple steps that you need to go through. It's very hard to turn the battleship. But as a small company, and I should say, before I go to the small company, and as a large company, you typically have better access to capital. So you cover a lot with safety stock, and it's all over the place. So, and when you get to the smaller company, your supply chain operating network, you're very, very thin on your working capital within your supply chain. So we see that as a small company, it is still very important to look at, you need to know what's going on within your service providers, and you need to be able to say, and many times what we see happening is you still can control it with an Excel spreadsheet as a small company. In a large company, no. You've got to start moving away, because the Excel spreadsheet, by the time it shows up, the data is stale and you have no idea what's going on. So we see the level of tools, or the complexity of the tools, change as you move up from a smaller company to a larger company. But fundamentally, you never want to confuse the complexity of the tool with the fundamental properness of the process, if you will. Because if you put a tool in place over a bad process, it's still a bad process, and it's not going to deliver what you were expecting. So if you're process focused and you're looking at the velocity, the smaller companies will typically have much higher velocity of that supply chain. And you don't have a whole lot of leverage with your suppliers as a smaller company, but you're able to get a hold of your data much faster than you are in a larger company. So we kind of see those that everybody still has a supply chain operating network. It's how it's implemented is a little bit different.
Great, thank you, Becky. Good question. I guess building on that question, do you see any differences between small companies and large companies in terms of who's at the table? I mean, is it more common to see the business leader of a smaller company be part of the conversation versus at a large company, or is it are they missing from the table equally, both large and small?
We're seeing that. We're seeing the business leader typically in a small company. We'll see the business leader more often because people in smaller companies, they have 10 assistants, 5 on their left hand and 5 on their right hand, and that's it. So I'm talking to the business leader who's also the VP of supply chain in that area. Whereas when you get to the bigger companies, you got to kind of go through this little path to figure out who does what. So at the smaller company, more often you're seeing somebody who's very, very tightly plugged into the customer and to the process more than I might see at a big company, because at that one we've got layers of management who work out of some far flung destination as opposed to someone from the plant. That's kind of the main difference you'll see in the size of the company when you go to have that conversation.
Yeah, no, it's been my experience as well when I talk to companies. Usually the smaller the company, I think that you tend to see that greater involvement from higher folks higher level in the organization in these types of things. We're kind of getting short on time here, so I've got just a couple of more questions. First, how do you see supply chain operating networks evolving over the next few years? What new capabilities will customers drive into these networks?
So we're seeing two things that are kind of enabled by the technology step change that's happened because of social networks. Um, Number one, the supply chain operating network, its future is not in messaging. Its future is in that passing data back and forth and checking on it as it's flowing through the pipeline. That's the number one thing we're seeing, is we're all trying to move towards creating networks that are user defined or user set up, user enabled. And in those networks, we're obviously going to have to do those adjudicate much better and validate that data. So we see that as a large thing that's going on. And then what we see is that the process change with the business rules being plugged into the network, so that you can get on this iterative journey to improve your data quality over a given period of time. So those are the two main things that we're watching happen. Less and less just hey, can you connect me to so and so, but more along the lines of, like I mentioned, the folks this morning who said, can you do this now that you've connected us? And that's more and more of the conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I also think that, I think the first generation, if you will, of supply chain operating networks was about, making those connections between computers and different applications and companies to, facilitate the flow of data and information, and of course, managing the quality. I think the next evolution, which you touched upon a little bit there, is really facilitating the communication collaboration between the people that are
Mhm.
actually, are the users of the network, right? So be able to facilitate, for peer-to-peer learning and networking and exchanging knowledge between, the individuals that are actually working at the different functional roles by all the participants that are part of that network. And I think that's the social networking piece of it, coming to fruition on the business side. So instead of sharing, pictures of cats and our kids or funny videos, the idea is to leverage these networks to share, kind of best practices, ask business-related questions, be able to, address problems faster or, collaborate faster on new, process changes and things like that. I think that's that's part of the future that I see that I'm really excited about. So to wrap up, Chris, for any supply chain logistics executives, particularly in the process industries that are watching, what questions should they ask themselves to determine if their supply chain processes and capabilities are best in class? In other words, what attributes will define supply chain success moving forward?
There's kind of two that I see happening. Number one is they have to ask the question, have I outsourced or have I dumb sourced? And what I mean by that, to outsource is to move an activity outside your company to be done as a part of your business in a way that you're still managing it. I've been involved in companies before where they outsourced it and then lost the knowledge to the point where they couldn't even make a shipment without calling the forwarder. That's a bad place to be in. And if your supply chain is so much that you've looked around and started to ask internally, how do we do something? And you get, well, let me make a call to somebody. You may be in a dumb source situation that you have to look at, okay, now how do I bring that knowledge back in-house without bringing all the cost of people and admin, et cetera, to get the job done back internally within the house? So that's the first question I always whenever time I go into a client, that's the first thing in the back of my head I'm looking at. Has this client outsourced or dumb sourced? And then that tells me where they need help. The other part is who controls your data. So as a client of ours, as we talk to them, it's too many people are sole sourced on their data. Well, I have to call this person to get this. It's kind of the cousin to dumb sourcing. They have no idea where their data is, or it's back over in SAP and I can't get that very easily either. So who controls your data and who controls what your data means? Is that you, Mr. or Miss Client, or is that your service provider responding to you because, like you said, you're so busy in your daily activities, you're just sole sourced. I had one Fortune 500 who had to call their freight forwarder to understand what shipments were on the water. It shouldn't be that way. You've got to get to a position where you've got that data internally in the house, and your freight forwarder is providing the expertise that they have as a part of a total solution, as opposed to, well, I go ask them and I find out. So those are kind of the two areas where I look at the data and then the process every time I walk in. And then from there, there's a plethora of questions that start, and you can go into a lot of detail from there.
Well, Chris, I must say I love the dumb sourcing reference there. I've never heard of that before, but I think I'm going to have to steal that at some point and write a blog posting on are you outsourcing or are you dumb sourcing? I'll give you full credit, but I love that, and I completely agree. I've been writing recently about companies that are looking to when they're thinking about outsourcing, and some of them the reasons they're not outsourcing or the reason some of them are even bringing operations back in house is because they want to have more control. And the question has always been raised: can you outsource and still maintain control? And the answer is yes, right? But you need to have, but part of the core capability to be able to do that, as you kind of talked about, is having that visibility, having, understanding where the data is coming from and things like that. So I think I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with some of the topics and conversations we've been talking about here recently. With that, Chris, we're out of time. As always, we always to just scratch the surface and all the topics we talk about here. I'm going to be privileged to be attending a user conference in a few weeks here, so I look forward to meeting your clients and kind of continuing this conversation there. And I'm sure I'm going to be coming back with some great insights from your customers there. But again, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today and sharing your thoughts and perspectives on supply chain operating networks.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Great, and for all those of you that are joining us today, thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. If you are watching this on demand and you do have a question or a comment for Chris, you can go ahead and find this episode at talkinglogistics.com. Find the episode and post a question or comment there, and I'm sure Chris will be happy to follow up via that platform as well. So with that, again, thank you everyone for joining, and have a great day, and we look forward to seeing a future episode of Talking Logistics. Goodbye.